invite you to open your Bible to Philippians chapter 1, Philippians 1, and today we're going to look at this wonderful little section of that chapter, which, as I mentioned last time, this really serves as a preamble. There's a longer section on Paul and his suffering and the suffering of the people there at Philippi, but even in this little introduction, this little preamble, we can gain and glean such great truths about our joy, our affliction, our attitude while we suffer. Your Bibles are open to Philippians 1. Let me read beginning in verse 12. Just follow along as I read aloud. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. So it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. Most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed. And in that I rejoice. I pray the Lord blesses the reading of His Word. You know, a good test to find your spiritual maturity, your spiritual strength, your spiritual vibrance is to see at what point your joy is taken. What does it take to steal your joy? At whatever point a person's joy breaks down, that is the end of their spiritual maturity. You can find out how mature you are, how virtuous you are, by finding where the angriness, the bitterness, the negativity, the critical spirit begins to invade your heart. I've often subjected myself to this test, and I've been amazed at how immature I am. I've been amazed that a little child, 50 pounds, can steal my joy. Someone's driving style can steal my joy. Traffic conditions. The way the street through Kapolei is paved. I think that's actually a legitimate cause to be angry, though. I think that's probably all of us. Jesus would probably be angry about that, too. I've been amazed, though, looking at my life, how easily my joy slips into criticism, into negativity, sometimes even bitterness. So I think this is a good test for all of us, is to ask that question, what steals my joy? And there is where you find your weaknesses. Because, as Paul said, we should rejoice always, and where we are unable to do that is where we are weakest. And Paul's life is a testimony, then, of spiritual maturity. He's a living testimony of someone of indomitable joy. This man took joy in whatever circumstance. In fact, for Paul, it seemed as his circumstances grew worse, as they grew darker, he shined brighter. He was more intent on being joyful. One commentator I read this week put it this way: he is a man whose joy knew no breaking point. There was never a time in the New Testament when the circumstances in Paul's life impacted his joy. In fact, it seems to us that he almost had a fighting back mentality. The greater the struggle, the greater the trial, the more insistent he is to articulate his joy. He is indeed larger than life as a living illustration of the perfect combination of severe affliction mingled with supreme joy. Now, as we look at this section, it does give us indeed this illustration of Paul, this man of great maturity, this man who's full of mature, instinctive, spirit-filled joy. And I have to say this here, if there's any characteristic that I would like to have, that I would like to carry in my own life, that I want my family to carry, that I want my church to have, that is that we would be constantly illustrating day in and day out in our workplace, in our homes, in our neighborhoods, this kind of divine joy. This virtue, it is my hope, is something that becomes so ingrained in my heart, in my life, that it defines me, my demeanor, and I would pray the same for you as well. It becomes a dominant characteristic of the Church of Makakilo Baptist. Part of Paul's joy was grounded in his attitude while suffering. When he faced difficulty, he had some particular attitudes, and one of them we began to touch on this last week in this little preamble. The fact is, we all suffer. We all have illnesses, we all have pain, we all have disappointment, we all face difficult people. We all battle even our own sins. We fight. So the question, we learned this last week, the question is not about how we can avoid suffering. The question is how to suffer. How can you find joy in suffering? It's a question of your maturity. It's a question of your spiritual strength, your joy of the Lord. And Paul lays out this one clear, very source of his joy, source in his attitude, and that is the advance of the gospel through his suffering. He connected the advance of the gospel to his pain, to his suffering. His joy was not found in temporal, earthly circumstances, what his health was doing, what people were saying, how his reputation was. His joy was connected to the advance of the gospel. His joy was connected to the glory of God as God was proclaimed to the nations. His joy, you could say, his joy was eternal. It was fixed on things that are not temporal, but eternal and forever. I think I mentioned this before some years ago, but it bears repeating. An illustration from John Newton. John Newton, of course, is the Puritan who wrote Amazing Grace. He says that we humans, we are prone to choose the lesser of blessings, the lesser of pleasures, the lesser of joys, in order to get them earlier. It's maturity, it's immaturity, that is. We like the lesser pleasure now rather than to wait for a greater pleasure later. To illustrate this principle, Newton gave a little story. Let me repeat it here. Suppose a man was going to New York to take possession of a large estate, and his carriage should break down a mile before he got to the city, which obliged him to walk the rest of the way. What a fool we should think of him if we saw him wringing his hands and blubbering out all the remaining mile, "My carriage is broken. My carriage is broken." You follow what Newton is saying? We get so caught up in temporal pleasure, in the condition of our lives and the comfort around us. We get so caught up in that, in our physical gratification here on earth, we forget that millions upon millions, multiplied millions of years of eternal rapturous bliss await us at the end of our life. We completely forget the inheritance that awaits us at the end of our life, an inheritance that is none other than Jesus Christ himself. So instead of blubbering about our hardships, and I'm not saying we cannot grieve. Jesus himself grieved in the Garden of Gethsemane, no doubt we can grieve, but blubbering with anxiety and frustration and irritability, this is ungodly. Instead of doing that, we should put our attention on those things that remind us of eternity, those eternal truths. We should put our focus and attention on those things and draw others' attention to those eternal truths as well. Well, nothing is so eternal than the truth of the gospel. Nothing is so helpful in your struggles, in your suffering, than focusing on the advancement of the gospel. So we should pray, Lord, show me, how can I use my difficulty? How can I use my struggle? How can I use my suffering to put a spotlight on the best news ever? How can I demonstrate to my friends and speak to my friends in the world? How can I join Jesus? How can I join in the fellowship of your sufferings? Now, this is the first question for Paul, and it gives us the first idea of how we should suffer from our text. So if you're taking notes, write this down. Number one, the way you suffer should spread the gospel message. The way you suffer should spread the gospel message. Look there at verse 12. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. Now, this is pretty easy to see as you read the Bible, particularly the book of Acts and the book of Philippians here. Paul, for a number of years, had wanted to go to Rome. He wanted to visit the Roman church there. Those of you who were here maybe 4 or 5 years ago when I started the book of Romans. Right there at the beginning of Romans, Paul is telling us this prayer request that he had, that he'd been praying that somehow God would allow him to go to Rome. The book of Romans was written 4 to 6 years before the book of Philippians. And in that time, God answered Paul's prayer, but maybe not in the way that we would have designed, right? We would have designed that the church there at Antioch would lay hands on him, give him a whole bunch of money, and send him to Rome. But that's not exactly what happened, right? Paul was arrested in Jerusalem. He appealed to Caesar. He spent some time in a dungeon in Caesarea. He was shipwrecked and finally made his way to Rome as a prisoner. And you think of all people, Paul should have said, this is a disaster. This mission trip is a disaster. I'm in prison. I can't go preach in the synagogue and encourage the church there at Rome. And I certainly can't prepare this church here in Rome to send people to Spain. I can't even go to Spain. I'm imprisoned. And yet Paul looks at this and says, no, this is indeed an answer to my prayer. Lord, I've been praying to go to Rome, and Lord, you paved the way. You got me to Rome in the exact condition, under the exact circumstances that you wanted. Prayer answered. So Paul didn't look at his circumstances and say, oh, now I can't preach the gospel. It's not exactly how I wanted it. No, Paul said, this encourages me to preach the gospel and advance the gospel even more. Look there at verse 13. So that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And what's Paul saying? Saying what has happened is this. Even though these aren't the circumstances I might choose, even though I didn't want to go to Rome in chains, what's happened is everybody has learned this is for the sake of Christ. This is a gospel thing that's happening. And they're hearing the gospel. They're hearing the truth of Christ. He says the imperial guard. So Caesar had this, his institution there, and and it would be sort of a court system, if you want to say it like that. This court system, so to speak. If you appealed to Caesar, you'd enter this court system, and all those people who were involved in that court system, involved in the prisoners and the transfer and all that stuff, they would be considered a part of Caesar's household. It wasn't just, Caesar's household was not just his family. That imperial guard was part of Caesar's household. The prison that Paul was in, which was a cell, and then later on probably more like an apartment, that was all part of Caesar's dominion, direct dominion in terms of his household, and eventually those appeals would make their way up through that court system. So Paul says these people, all these individuals, these people in the imperial guard, the people in Caesar's household have heard the gospel. And it gets even better. Flip over to chapter 4, very end of Philippians. Look what Paul says, chapter 4, verse 21. Greet every saint in Christ Jesus. The brothers who are with me greet you. All the saints greet you, especially those of Caesar's household. What's he saying? There are newly minted saints, Christians, in Caesar's household. People are getting saved. Not only did Paul evangelize, but he got to see fruit in the imperial guard, in Caesar's household. He saw fruit. He saw the result of his evangelistic effort right there in the middle of his prison sentence. Now, the truth is, God never promises any kind of volume in terms of the fruit and people's response to the gospel. If you go by the things that Jesus says, what you'll find is mainly people reject the gospel. God doesn't promise us that a whole bunch of people or every person we witness to will be saved, or our church will be huge and influential, and the community will look positively toward us. But we do get the idea from Matthew chapter 9, Luke chapter 10, that there is a harvest out there that God is asking folks to come and reap. That if you are faithful in sharing the gospel, you will at some point enjoy the harvest. The same idea is presented later on in 2 Timothy chapter 2, that soldiers get their pay, farmers reap their crops, athletes get their reward. And the illustration is to encourage Timothy to make disciples. And the idea is that, hey, there may be many people who reject, maybe most people reject, but you will get to enjoy some of the reward if you are indeed faithful to share the gospel. Now, Paul didn't spark an awakening in the Roman Empire, but a number of people right there in Caesar's household were saved. What a joy for Paul. What a motivation for Paul. You say, well, I'd like to share the gospel. I'd like to spread the truth in my context and my suffering, but I've never gone to a training seminar of how to share the gospel. You don't have to go to a training seminar. If you're a Christian, you know the gospel. You're a step ahead of a lost person, okay? Just give them what you got. And there are more mature Christians around you here, and that's why we have church for one reason, is to help you continue to share the gospel in better and better ways, to memorize scriptures, to learn things to say to those who are lost. But if you just understand the basics, you can speak to those around you the truth of the gospel. Trust me, this is a prayer that God is pleased to hear. When you start praying for opportunities, when you start praying that God would open your eyes and provide for you clear opportunities to share the gospel. God is pleased to hear you say, Lord, I want to be a laborer in your harvest. Open my eyes. Lord, help me see people as they are. Help me see the lostness of this world. Lord, give me the words to say. Give me a clear opportunity to share the gospel with somebody. That's a prayer that God is pleased to answer in the affirmative, and oftentimes He does in the midst of your trouble, like He does with Paul here. Your struggles, your trouble becomes a context through which the gospel flows. People will get saved. God will be reaping His harvest through you in the midst of your hardship. So that's point number one. The way you suffer should advance the gospel. You are speaking to lost people of Christ. Number two, the way you suffer should encourage other believers. The way you suffer should encourage other believers. Look there at the beginning of verse 14. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing I'm put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. So what we have here are two groups of people who are emboldened, who are motivated to preach the gospel, to share Christ because of Paul's imprisonment. Did you see the two groups there? First of all, Paul's suffering emboldened those who preached with the motive to extend Paul's ministry. That's subpoint A, if you're taking notes. These are the ones Paul mentioned are preaching Christ from goodwill. They're ones who are doing it out of love, knowing that Paul's imprisonment is for the defense of the gospel. This is all part of God's sovereign, massive plan to announce His gospel to the nations. And God has put Paul here for a reason, and part of it is to embolden me to go out and speak. So these people whom Paul is encouraging with his bold witness, these are the people who get it. These brothers, and I think by mentioning brothers, I think he's probably referring to other pastors, men who are preaching, but got a broad implication. This applies to everyone, right? It would encourage everyone. These are the preachers, the elders, the men who lead the churches who get it, who understand what God is doing here, who take this not as a big setback, but as something that is a great advancement of the gospel. These are the ones who see Paul there in that Roman prison, and they immediately understand. They give Paul the benefit of the doubt. God's not sidelining Paul. He's not obscuring Paul. He's putting Paul right where He wants him to speak the gospel. This is not an accident. This is not some form of punishment. Paul is in prison for the advance of the gospel. And these guys hearing of Paul's continued evangelism, his continued witness behind bars, possibly chained for some time. They understand God put him there, piled on the hardship, for the express reasoning of advancing the gospel. And it compels them to extend Paul's ministry. It emboldens them. It motivates them to extend Paul's ministry. A number of you came up to me last week after the end of the service. If you remember, I closed with an illustration of my mother who passed away a number of years ago, and she, the last 9 years of her life, as she was dying with cancer, there was sort of a gospel explosion in the medical community because she was just evangelizing everyone. She was giving the gospel to everyone. And a number of you came up to me and said, that encourages me so much, that if she can evangelize while hooked up to the chemo, if she can evangelize in that condition, I can evangelize in my small hardship. Well, that's what was happening right here. Paul was evangelizing. People saw that boldness, and they wanted to join Paul's effort. They wanted to extend Paul's effort. They mimicked his attitude. They shared Christ with boldness. And I suspect it has a really practical idea, too. They could have thought, well, the worst they can do is throw me in jail. The worst they can do is kill me, and that means I just meet Christ. And they saw the boldness of Paul. They saw the evangelism of Paul. They saw his witness. And they said, why would I fear in any way whatsoever? I should be emboldened. Our testimony and love for the gospel amidst our suffering, in the middle of our difficulty, will have a direct, encouraging effect on other believers. And that's what I want. My prayer is that as I suffer in life, as I face difficulties, as I face hardship, as I face hard things in life, that I will suffer in such a way that will encourage others to stay faithful, to continue to do the work of the evangelist, to motivate and compel them, to embolden them to evangelize as well. Some of the most stirring stories of the gospel witness come from the martyrs who were faithful all the way to death there in those first few centuries. I'm reminded this week of the story of Polycarp, 2nd century martyr. It said that throughout his arrest, he did very similar thing as Paul. He began to evangelize the guards and the guys who take care of the jail, the jailers. And as he continued to preach the gospel, a number of guards came to know Christ. They repented. They became Christians. They were saved. They joined him, just like Paul. Finally, in the end, they brought him to where they would execute him. They had this big crowd out there, right? And they called out to him. They said, Polycarp, if you would just renounce Christ, if you would just reproach Christ, just say one sentence, I reproach Christ, and your life will be spared. It is reported that Polycarp said this, 86 years I have served him, and he never once wronged me. How then shall I blaspheme my king who has saved me? With those words, they lit the fire around his feet. He was tied to a pole. They lit the fire around his feet. As he was burning to death, they decided to make sure that he had died, so they went up and pierced him in his side, much like they did Christ, his crucifixion. So much blood emptied out of his body at that one piercing, it extinguished most of the fire. And they had to rebuild the fire until he was burnt to ashes. Well, it was his testimony and many others that compelled other believers to continue to boldly preach. It compelled people to continue to spread the gospel witness year after year. It is of that era that Tertullian, the church historian, would write, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. In the middle of that martyrdom, the church exploded. It expanded. The gospel went all over the earth. People heard the gospel. It encouraged other believers to tell the gospel and encourage them in their boldness, and it encouraged them in their faith. That suffering of all those martyrs served to motivate one another. Like-minded believers pushed for the expanse of the gospel more and more boldly. And that's precisely what was happening in Paul's life. As he was suffering incarceration there, as he continued to witness, as he continued to boldly preach the gospel, people of like mind were encouraged. They were motivated. Well, Paul mentions some other believers who were also motivated. These are some fellows who had less than holy motivations. He says, even in their case, his hardship has promoted gospel preaching. Look at verse 15. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry. Verse 17, they proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Now, we've got to identify these people. We've got to work on this a little bit before we can correctly understand who these people were. There's a few clues here to help us understand what's going on. First, it says there's people who are doing this out of envy. The word there means to desire, to deprive others of what is theirs. Now, jealousy brings it all to yourself, right? Jealousy is the next step, is to say, I want what he has for myself. But envy is sort of the first step by saying, or this mentality of saying, that person doesn't deserve that. I don't want that guy to have what he has. It's to find reasons in your own mind why you believe they shouldn't have what they have. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all the Gospels, we find out that the legalists, scribes and Pharisees primarily looked upon Jesus. They looked upon his popularity. They looked upon the authority with which he preached, and they were envious of him. Same word. They didn't want him to have that popularity. They didn't want him to have that giftedness. They didn't like that he had that following. And they hated him because of it. Of course, we would see later on that's why they crucified him. Now, these men envied Paul. They envied his ability. They envied his position as an apostle. They envied his following. They envied that a lot of people had been impacted by his ministry. They wished he didn't have it. And they saw Paul as a threat to their own fame, their own popularity, the display of their own gifts. Their own aspirations were muted because you had this huge figure in the life of the church, the Apostle Paul. So these men, they were profoundly glad to hear that Paul was in prison. In their minds, he had been stealing their limelight, and so finally he's been sidelined. He's been put to the side. He's washed up. He's old news. No more following for Paul. Time for us to step up and take the fame we always wanted. And that's the word envy. They preach Christ from envy. The second word is rivalry there. The word is eris, E-R-I-S. This is contention, strife. This is that attitude of envy coming out of their mouths, right? This is them talking about all these things, sporting an attitude. This is the gossip that they spread with one another. I mean, you can just hear what's happening, right? Here's these guys very jealous of Paul, very envious of Paul, very irritated with Paul, wanting to be a famous preacher, wanting to have a large church, wanting to be as popular as Paul. They see him finally sidelined in their minds and sent to prison. And with a little smirk on their face, they might have said to someone else, another pastor, you hear about Paul? He's in prison now. You know, I knew he shouldn't have been so reckless. You know, he was out there. He was so bold. He was a little reckless, you know. I heard he's in prison. A little smirk on their face. They were glad to finally to take up and maybe find some popularity in their own right. They like to share the bad news of Paul. That's this idea, the word eris there. It's this idea of sharing bad news, of spreading it. This is what gossipers are always all about, right? Even if it's in the form of a prayer request, right? They enjoy sharing bad news. They like talking about bad news about other people, and that's what these guys were doing. They were rivals of Paul. They were gossipers. They loved to search around and find others who felt the way they did, and yeah, I feel that way too, and it's finally time for that guy to be sidelined. When someone would stand up to them and say, that's kind of gossipy, isn't it? They'd turn away from that person and find someone who'd listen. This is how gossipers are. So that's the idea here. They were envious, and they had sort of joined together in their rivalry, their contention against Paul. Finally, it says that these men sought to afflict him. Obviously, this is not a physical affliction. I don't think they actually wanted to beat him. They couldn't beat him. They probably weren't in the same town. But they wanted to mean harm to Paul. And it says they did this out of selfish ambition. I think the idea, the cue is that mentality, that selfish ambition. You got envy, you got rivalry, you got selfish ambition. These guys, they're doing all of this. They're feeling this way about Paul for selfish reasons. They don't necessarily have a bone to pick with Paul himself. It's not like Paul hurt their feelings one day walking down the street. It's not that Paul did something personally against them. It's not personal, it's business, right? They wanted to be like Paul. They had ambitions. They had aspirations of popularity. And Paul's great popularity prevented them as being as popular as they wanted to be. So when Paul was finally what they thought sidelined, they were very quick to step up, and they were emboldened to preach strong sermons, to stand out. They wanted to have the limelight, and so they were motivated as they are in their studies. And I know it's hard to believe that pastors would actually be like this, but some aren't. Obviously not me, but some are. These guys in their studies are just thinking, oh man, now's my chance. I'm going to preach a sermon. It's going to be like a silver bullet. People are going to be so amazed, they're going to forget Paul ever existed. My church is going to grow. There's going to be more people. Finally, that Paul has been set aside. This is my golden opportunity. That's how these men thought. Well, all that to say this. On the one hand, you have, in Paul's imprisonment, you have his friends. You have sincere believers, sincere preachers, and they were encouraged to be bolder, to follow, to expand, to extend Paul's ministry. And you have those who are preaching the gospel, but it's out of impure motives. They're trying to take Paul's place. They wanted his fame. They wanted his leadership. They wanted to seize the opportunity in his absence to gain glory for themselves. So you could say they preached the gospel bolder in an effort to eclipse Paul's ministry. Just summarizing these two ideas. That's what a sermon outline is, after all. The way Paul suffered emboldened those who preached with a desire to extend Paul's ministry, and it emboldened even those who preached with the motive to eclipse Paul's ministry. That's what Paul is saying here. Paul is saying there are those with false motives. And this, believe it or not, has even emboldened them to preach the gospel. Now, we can assume that wasn't Paul's objective. I'm going to go to prison and I'm going to make sure and embolden my rivals. I'm sure he hoped to encourage his friends and to just be faithful. I think Paul's prime motivation was simply to be faithful to the Lord. I don't think he wasted many brain cells thinking about his rivals. Nevertheless, Paul does note this happy consequence. Even those who have impure motives, who don't like me, have been emboldened with a motive to preach the gospel bolder. They want to preach the gospel, and in that I rejoice. And this gives us a little bit of application here. When you suffer with the gospel on your lips, when the praise of God in your heart, when eternal truths come flowing out of you in the midst of your suffering, in spite of your suffering, you continue to have this joy, continue to have this gospel mentality. When you suffer in this way, there are joyous, wonderful repercussions that you didn't even expect. There are things that happen that you didn't even expect. It's like what Paul said in 2 Corinthians 12. He had this struggle. He never identifies what this is. He had this struggle. He says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he, meaning God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, Paul says, I will boast all the more gladly in my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. God's glory is enunciated, not Paul's, but God's glory, the power of the gospel. Even through impure motives and weak men and rivalries and gossip and Paul's imprisonment, even in the midst of all that, the gospel is proven. The glory of God is proven. God himself, through his Spirit, convicting people of sin and saving people, is proven through the preaching of his word. So whether you understand it, whether you plan for it, whether you think about it or not, God is making his power known through you when you suffer with the gospel and the praise and glory of God on your lips. Well, let me wrap this up. Sinclair Ferguson, I finished a book this week called Devoted to God. Sinclair Ferguson says that our union with Christ does not protect us from suffering, but commits us to suffering. It's an important principle to remember, isn't it? A lot of people want to get saved thinking it's going to keep them from suffering in this life, but if you look at the life of Paul, if you look at the language of Jesus Christ, the language of Paul, the other apostles, Peter and others, what you find out is that when you unify with Christ, you're not just unifying with him in terms of victorious, eternal glory, you're also unifying with him in suffering on this earth. And that's what Paul would say later in chapter 3, that his deepest desire is to know him and the power of his resurrection, but, doesn't stop there, that I may share in his sufferings, becoming like him in my death. That's what you do when you commit to Christ, right? When you unify with Christ, you unify with him not just in the glory, but in his sufferings. Earlier this week in my devotion, I was reading Psalm 13. Psalm 13 is David sort of writing from the bottom. He is at the absolute bottom of the barrel. He had sinned. Others had sinned against him. It's like he'd suffered all the evil that we talked about last week, the evil from others, his own evil, natural evil, all that had sort of come upon him. And mostly in that psalm, from the first verse forward, and mostly it's David just weeping, just crying. But as he often does, he ends his song remembering the salvation and the truth of God, really ultimately pointing us to the gospel. The last two verses of Psalm 13, but I have trusted in your steadfast love. This is him from the bottom of the barrel. I have trusted in your steadfast love. So he's trusted. He's trusting. It's that, going all the way back to Paul at the beginning of Philippians, this understanding, this trust in a sovereign God in charge of everything. I trust you. I don't doubt your love for me, God. He says, I have trusted your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. Lord, I focus my attention on what you have done. I focus on the fact that you have saved me. I will speak of these doctrines. I will announce these truths, sing of these truths. I will preach the gospel. And finally, he says, I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. Lord, I will sing to you in spite of my suffering. I will display this joy because you have saved me. This gospel, this life-transforming, life-changing, eternal truth has changed my life, and I will sing of your praise. I will announce your good news. Well, that's the way David suffered. That's the way Paul suffered. That's the way Christ suffered. That's the way I want to suffer.